So some of you may have some familiarity with Bitcoin. And to be honest, a lot of this, it's 5 minutes. I'm not going to get into Bitcoin or how Bitcoin works. But generally, I think people have a general idea that Bitcoin is a way to send a value, a Bitcoin, person to person where you can be your own bank. It's borderless, it's totally open source, and it allows anyone or any two parties to exchange value. And the values there are Bitcoins. Now, one of the interesting things that happened is this technology solved a very large problem in computer science called the Byzantine generals problem, which is essentially, how do I trust an untrusted party? And this problem is actually at the heart of a lot of the problems of why financial technology has not innovated. And if you look at the fintech space overall, it's been one of the worst innovators in the last 200 to 300 years. So the original inventor of the ATM network were the Knights Templar. Most people don't know this. These were guys with swords who worked in the Crusades, and if you had gold and you didn't want to get robbed on the road, you would go to them, give them gold. They would give you a coded piece of paper, and you could travel safely with this coded piece of paper and show up at a new city, present your paper, and they would give you back gold. It was the ATM, very first implementation of an automated teller network. But it was always involving a trusted third party. So they always had this middleman, and throughout history, these middlemen have failed. Fraud, bank overruns, and so what's happened is we pass a whole bunch of laws, regulation, to regulate these banks. So only certain people can be banks. You have to be insured, you have to follow these laws, you have to lock up the list of who has money. So this has led to essentially ledgers. Because Bitcoin at its heart, and the network of Bitcoin, is a distributed ledger system. So these ledger systems that have existed in the past have huge verifications, there's lots of steps, they're closed systems that don't allow outside parties to build on. And this has led to kind of a stagnation in financial services innovation. If we look at the innovation that's happened in the internet over the last 20 years, it's been explosive. If you look at innovations in some other areas, credit cards. Credit card was invented in 1955. We got a magnetic stripe somewhere around 1965. In the US, we just started to deploy smart cards like chips and pins. So around 60 years, we've gone from magnetic stripe to pins cards. And now we have NFC. So, 4 big innovations in payment for credit cards in the last 60 years. And the whole area has suffered this problem. And one of the things we're seeing is these things are also very vulnerable, because as much as you lock up your ledger, hackers get access to it. So there was a recent report about hackers who infiltrated a network of banks and stole $400 million through wire transfers by pretending to be bank employees. So that, we've seen this kind of systematic problem of risk. So some of the banking networks you may not know, there's something called SWIFT. This is what allows you to transfer money from bank to bank. It's around 3 to 7 days, costs anywhere from $40 to $60 to send a bank transfer. We have ACH transfer, which is how checks clear. There's generally around 15 different parties who are involved in making sure that your check is routed and cleared. And depending on where you are in the world, this can take anywhere from 5 to 7 days to up to 3 to 4 weeks. So in emerging economies like China, there's a 3-week clearing period when a business pays you with a check. Now, the alternative to this that was introduced with Bitcoin is something we call the blockchain. So this is the underlying network that powers Bitcoin. It is a distributed network, and it's built off open source code. What's unique about it is anyone can be a node. Anyone can join. It's like a peer-to-peer network. And you can download a copy of the ledger, and because of the cryptography, everyone is guaranteed to have a same copy of the ledger and to verify all the transactions. So this is where there's no middleman. This is incredibly exciting. It's decentralized, it's fast. You can generally do confirmations anywhere from 10 to 30 minutes. So what used to take 3 to 7 days or 2 weeks can now happen instantaneously around the world. But it had some problems. One is scalability. So right now, the current blockchain only hits around 7 transactions per second. And so there's a lot of questions on if it is going to grow, how do we grow it? How do we scale this network? Visa at holiday times does around 70,000 transactions per second, just to give you an idea of the comparison. Right now, the blockchain only knows one asset. It knows how to talk Bitcoin. And as much as everyone is excited about Bitcoin's potential, especially in some new areas like machine-to-machine communication, Internet of Things, the developing world, microfinance, there's huge potential. There's also a lot of people who prefer to deal with things like US dollar, Canadian dollar, or other assets. And so a bunch of people started saying, how can we actually use something like the blockchain for our asset or other assets? And that wasn't possible. And what this happened is because Bitcoin's open source, we saw a bunch of people copy the open source code, all trying to make their own coins. And this was generally, the analogy I like to use is, let's imagine back in 1994 when the internet was being built. And someone said, I want to build a shopping site called Amazon. But to connect to my website, you need to disconnect from the internet and connect with a different TCP IP driver. And someone else says, we're going to do streaming audio on the internet. But you have to disconnect from the internet and use my version of TCP IP. We would not have the internet we have today if everyone was fragmented and everyone was building their own copy of a protocol. And so the question became, and this was the impetus or the problem we wanted to solve, was everyone wanted to do something new on the blockchain. People were looking at it as a potential platform for innovating all financial services and a larger scale of problems. But the Bitcoin network, because it's an open source network, can't make changes that fast. There's anywhere from $5 to $10 billion resting on this network. So the pace of introducing change is very different than most applications. It's very much akin to reprogramming the flight control system on the space shuttle as it's in liftoff, right? That's not the time you want to be pushing updates or changes. So this has kind of led to a huge fragmentation. Everyone wants to standardize. There's a beautiful network called the blockchain. It's right now, the power and the amount of data, it's 350 megawatts, 350 petahashes. That's 350 million billion hashes, which is the computing cycle, every second are being used to do this network. But no one figured out how do we teach it to do anything else. And that's where we got together with some of the Bitcoin core programmers to build something called sidechains. This is the limit of my demo. Demoing APIs is hard, demoing cryptography is very hard. But the basic idea, and I can give for people not familiar, was how could we actually shard? If you're familiar with like virtual machines on servers, your server may be only running at 10% capacity, so you run multiple virtual machines and you can increase your utilization of your hardware. You can also, this is also known as sharding, infrastructures. So the question was, could we build multiple parallel blockchains that could interoperate, that could allow assets to move from one blockchain to another, and those new blockchains could have different features that don't appeal to everyone, and they don't need to. So all of a sudden, the idea of sandboxing or having your own development environment where you can build a distributed identity system, a registry system, smart property. We've seen IBM looking at this for Internet of Things, so your appliances can talk to each other and communicate on a machine-to-machine level without having to go through a central authority. So all these ideas started coming, but no one figured out how to use the same hardware infrastructure. And this is what sidechains does. We essentially take a Bitcoin. For those people who are versed in Star Wars, I think this audience generally is Star Wars aware. Think of it like Han Solo being frozen in carbonite. We take a Bitcoin and we freeze it in carbonite. We lock it up in a cryptographic escrow function. And that Bitcoin is now held and can't be unlocked unless someone provides a proof. And what you do is you prove that that Bitcoin is now locked up, and you can now go to a sidechain and show that cryptographic proof, and you can get a new asset on the sidechain that has all these new properties. Things like micropayments, native asset. So there's a whole range of potential applications. And then if you ever want to move it back to Bitcoin, you can destroy it on the sidechain and come back and show what's called an SPV proof, a simple payment verification proof, which is a small cryptographic statement, and prove you burned it over here to reinitiate the asset. Now, it's a little technical. This somewhat gets into the challenges. There's maybe 25 to 30 people who have been major contributors to the Bitcoin code base. Even though it has exploded, we've seen $600 million of venture capital invested in the space. It's actually sitting on a very, very narrow group of programmers. The Linux kernel, for instance, has around 80,000 contributors who have contributed at one time or another to the Linux kernel. The Bitcoin community, the number of people who understand this is very small. So to do this, we needed them. So we co-founded a company. We have 11 co-founders. A large part of the Bitcoin core developers who thought this was the way forward for Bitcoin joined us as co-founders. We released a white paper in October. One of the big challenges is we can't force any change. This is an open source community. So we have to socialize this, we have to get it vetted, we have to have the math and the cryptography reviewed, we have to do threat models, and then over time, we hope to get this accepted. So at the same time, we're trying to introduce this new paradigm and this way for Bitcoin to evolve, we have to deal with getting community acceptance. And so that's an interesting challenge. But what this enables us to do is the miners, some people may have heard of Bitcoin miners, but the Bitcoin miners who are processing all these transactions, okay, who are doing an algorithm called Hashcash, which was invented by my co-founder, which is essentially like generating a lottery ticket. You're generating these lottery tickets, you're generating millions and billions of them, and every 10 minutes, one of them wins, and you get to enter a certain number of transactions into the ledger. We've taught that hardware to be able to do that for lots of different lotteries. So it can do that for not only the main blockchain, but it can do that for sidechain. So this allows us to have special purpose blockchains for different applications. Some of the areas and some of what excites me about this, there are a whole range of these trusted third parties in financial services who have really built their business off being middlemen. So globally, they average around 3% of all transactions in the world goes to someone in the fintech space. So underwriting IPOs is around 5 to 7, retail banking is around 1.5%. Collectively, though, this is around $15 trillion. It's almost 20% of the world's GDP goes to bankers and financial service players. And that has faced no competition in the last couple hundred years. And so the idea of an open network where anyone can plug in is you can start to introduce a lot of competition. And so the same way what the internet did for information transfer and publishing, so that a newspaper wasn't the only way to talk to a lot of people, we think this can do for financial innovation. And that's very exciting to us. So some of the sidechains we're talking about distributed markets, so new ways to do settlement, stock trades, crowdfunding, microfunding, especially in the developing nations. We've seen some governments, especially in Latin America, whose currencies have a lot of volatility, who are looking about issuing digital money. And so the question kind of in the long term is, I think a lot of people in the technology area are very excited about kind of the future, but very few people think about how money is going to work. So if we have robotic cars, Google and others want to get us there, I don't think anyone really imagines sitting at, let's say you take a robotic taxi across New York City and your cost is $3. I don't think anyone imagines 10 years from now we're going to be feeding crumpled up paper bills into a bill feeder trying to pay for that cab. But the alternative is, should I have to pay $1.50 of that to a credit card company? Especially when 2.5 to 3 billion people on the planet don't have credit cards. They don't have bank accounts. So the opportunity to change some of that financial infrastructure with something that is provably fair and honest financial plumbing. It's honest because it's transparent and it's built off math, and not because you're trusting some third party. So that's kind of a just quick summary. I think I'm good for time.